You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my pleasure to have on again Ben Fleming, and we are going to be talking about pieces of paper and how they can't actually protect your civil liberties and why this is the case. And we're going to do so through the lens of Jeremy Bentham's critique of the French rights of the document, the Rights of Man, and citizen. Yeah. And it's interesting because I threw out on Twitter the other day an observation that Jacques Ellul made, and he said, the revolution, and he said in this case he was looking at both the American and French revolutions, and he says that the revolution gets betrayed the moment that you try to instantiate it in institutions meant to protect the ideals of the revolution. So he says, if you have a revolution, let's say like the American, against, the king who is oppressive and, hindering your rights, and you're fighting for liberty against an abusive government, an abusive government presence. He says, well, what happens then? He says, unless the revolution or the revolt consumes itself, he says, eventually you have to kind of stop and say, okay, we've won. Now, how do we instantiate our gains, or how do we secure our gains? And so you develop a system. And what the answer was in the revolutionary period is we're going to take these ideas of liberty, we're going to develop them into a set of ideas that we're going to put on paper, and then we're going to instantiate them in a series of institutions. And so, as you begin to think about what happens in that moment, so you are a group of citizens fighting for your liberty, fighting for the ability to manage and determine your own affairs. And as soon as you win, you band together and then drop a document that says, these are the things that we fought for. Let's develop a series of governmental institutions to make sure that the government never oppresses us again and takes away our liberties. And Ellul says the moment that you win the revolution and try to instantiate it to make it enduring, he says you've actually betrayed the whole thing. And so I was thinking, actually, when I put that tweet, I said this is actually going to be really interesting to have Ben here to talk about Jeremy Bentham's essay. So that's a long introduction. Welcome, Ben, and I'm looking forward to having you go through Bentham's essay on this subject.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I guess I'm going to start by talking about who Bentham is. I'm sure this is a philosophy channel, so I'm sure most people know who Bentham is, but just in case somebody doesn't, he is best known as the guy who came up with utilitarianism, the idea that society should be organized around the greatest amount of utility for the greatest number of people. This was one of the underlying philosophies of Victorian Britain, and largely the British Empire at its peak. In fact, I would say that the concept of utilitarianism is one of the things that separated, at least historically, Canada from the States, at least in the 19th century. He is also known for the concept of the panopticon, because this was the Industrial Revolution. He said if you were to create a prison with a bunch of cells in corridors coming out like spokes of a wheel, and you had a rotating watchtower in the middle, you could make the prisoners behave because they wouldn't know when they were being watched. You could have one or two wardmen watching the entire, or you could have one or two wardmen keeping discipline in the entire prison because nobody would know when they are and are not being watched. That's one thing that he's more famous for. But one thing that he's maybe a little less known for is he wrote an essay in 1796 called Anarchical Fallacies. 1796, that year, is important because it is 7 years after 1789, which is when both the American Constitution was ratified and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was written. And interestingly enough, he really doesn't talk about the American Revolution and the American Constitution in this essay. I bring that up. I say that's interesting because he is ripping on the French. He's ripping on a lot of these ideas that the French are coming up with. When you read this essay, he almost sounds like he's making fun of the American boomercon who walks around with a copy of the Constitution in his pocket, thinking that this piece of paper is where all of my rights emanate from, or at least the piece of paper that protects all of my rights. He does not say a single bad word about the Americans, and George Washington is still president at this time. The American Revolution is still within living memory, but this is a British guy making fun of a bunch of French academics for some of their more utopian ideas, and kind of almost this almost sounds like a Canadian making fun of Americans in the 21st century when you read some of these ideas. But to be very clear for any Americans who are listening, this is not making fun of Americans at all. It's making fun of the French. He predicts a ridiculous number of things in this essay. The essay is maybe 10 or 12 pages long. It's with an intro and a conclusion. The middle of it is just a line-by-line refutation of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And is within 10 or 12 pages, he says this idea of having a universal set of rights, not even just for Frenchmen, but for man in general, or an abstract concept like the citizen. He says this is a really stupid idea, and for reasons A, B, C, D, and E, these disasters are all going to happen. And now in the 21st century, looking back on the 20th century, when a lot of these universalist ideas were instantiated after World War II, the number of predictions that he got right is just amazing, especially for a document that's as short as this essay was. I'll give you a couple of examples. You talked about how you need to make the ideals of a revolution endure. Well, he says when you write down a document that says when a government, when a set of legislators is and is not legitimate, all you're doing is sowing the seeds of the next revolution, because you've given them a set of conditions in which they're allowed to have an insurrection. Another thing that he talks about is how it's going to make men and women argue with each other by saying that a husband must be the same as a wife because everybody has equal rights in society. He says that cops are going to be afraid to arrest criminals. He says that we're going to end up having to accommodate for all sorts of mental illnesses and crazy people because the crazy people are supposed to have the same rights as the same people. Just the number of, and this is just a short list, but just the number of things that he got right in this 250-year-old essay, I guess 225-year-old essay, it's just amazing to read now. Not just in the number of predictions that he got right, but he almost sounds like he's making fun of the American regime when he's not saying a word about the Americans. He's talking about the French. So the important thing there is that at some point, this mythos about the French Revolution got transposed onto the Americans at some point in the 20th century. That's another thing you realize from reading this thing.
Yeah, and I think it's good for people to realize, though, too, that there are two broad major streams of Enlightenment liberal political thinking. One is the French universalist, and one is the more English, which roots itself in common law. And so, the common law, the best way to describe common law would be sort of the thing that the laws that operate in the commons, in a sense, the kind of laws held in the memory of the people that everybody kind of everybody knows this is just right and this is just wrong. And the common law is, in a sense, a judge is then asked to interpret the common laws of the people, and based on tradition and custom, will then make a ruling. And now this ruling then gets added to the collective bulk of common law. Now the American tradition comes out of that stream of common law. Now the Constitution is an abstracted version of that common law, but culturally it was rooted in this sort of English common law tradition. But gradually over time, as America scaled up in terms of its own country, but also then with the global American empire, it's almost like a necessary transition needed to be made, because you can't sustain common law at the scale of a society of 300 million people in a global empire. It has to be universalized. And at that point, then the American Constitution stops being interpreted and thought about in a way that's rooted in English common law and in the traditions and customs of the people, but becomes a set of universal abstract ideals. Now, the potential for that was always there because of the way, when you take a common law tradition and then you abstract it and then write it down on paper, as long as that living tradition has enough oomph to sustain itself, it's fine. But as soon as that tradition begins to wane, the stuff on the paper still exists, and then it just becomes a series of abstract ideas. So I think that transition, and I think this is something kind of that Ellul notes as well too, that it was inevitable that the French universalist, way of understanding rights would eventually dominate. At least that's my thought of it. That was kind of in the way that the modern world was going. The French universalist understanding was, if you had to lay odds at the time, the betting man, the smart bet would have been to put the money on the abstract universalism.
I agree with what you said there, but there is one wrinkle that we need to add in, and that's that this was not just a slow-moving evolution over the centuries.
No.
In the early 20th century, the so-called progressive era, we talked a little bit about this last time when we was on the show. You had people like John Dewey, you had people like Herbert Crowley, who set out their vision for the new America of the 20th century.
And this was
going to rethink democracy. Yeah. Okay.
But this also emerges, though, Ben, I think if I remember saying, out of the northern industrialists sort of gaining dominance in the United States at the end of they won the Civil War, and thus the school of thought that emerges out of northern industrialism then gains ascendancy in the late 1800s and really sort of comes onto the main stage in the early 20th century.
Yeah, you're correct, but what I'm saying is people like, especially Herbert Crowley, he says explicitly, this new technology, it's going to give us a second chance at the French Revolution. The French, they failed.
Yes.
They had a chance to come up with a system that was not just going to be good for France, it was going to be good for all of mankind. Now we Americans have a second chance at this. And he says this explicitly. This isn't just something that, permeates his writing. He explicitly says we have a chance to be like the 18th century Frenchmen, not like the 19th century British people who are, they're running an impressive empire, but they're just trying to do good things that are good for the British people. We don't want that. We want the American century to be a time of values that are good for all of mankind. And what's the first thing they do is they jump into World War I and get rid of the Habsburgs and get rid of the Hohenzollerns and uproot some of these European ruling dynasties that have been there for 500, 600, 700 years, and just expect that by imposing this new industrial universal democracy, this is what everybody wants and it's what's going to work. I mean, it was explicitly supposed to be a second try at the French Revolution. This is not just a coincidence. This is not just a slow evolution over decades and centuries.
Well, no, and it extended to, former colonies. I mean, this is basically what happened to Rhodesia, because Rhodesia was an inherently conservative society and it had to be made liberal. And so, the American empire backed basically the destruction of Rhodesia because it wasn't liberal enough.
Yeah, that's post World War II when you have the
But,
United
yeah.
Nations involved, and that's something I was.
But it's
planning
all
on
an
talking
extension
about
of the
later.
same ethos of ideas, I think, though, right?
Well,
And
it's
that's
not even just a it's not even just a general ethos. It's the UN. What's one of the first things they do is they come up with their own Declaration of Rights of Man or Declaration of Human Rights. I can't remember what it's called. And Eleanor Roosevelt, when she's introducing this, she says it explicitly. She says, first you had the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, then you had the American Bill of Rights, and now we have this new thing. And just again, it's the utopian way of thinking. We've written this down. We're a bunch of smart people, so there's no way this is going to fail. Every country that wants to be part of the United Nations is going to have to follow this set of enumerated rights that we've just written down. And Rhodesia was considered an illegitimate government largely because of this document that was written. So, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but when you're talking
they're just building from they're just building from strength to strength, as you know, the ideas of the you know, liberal universalism, you know, as it extends everywhere and brings freedom to mankind. And I mean, they really believe this stuff, and many still do. So this brings us back to Bentham, and you know, where he just looks at this whole thing and says, well, here's why this is dumb, actually.
Yeah. So how would you define constitutionalism? Let me ask you that.
Yeah, I think, so I would probably be inclined to say that at its heart, you know, the French system would be that you take all of the traditions of mankind, of law and so forth, you abstract them, you rationalize them, and then you universalize them, and then you reimpose them back on society to, you know, ultimately through the mechanism of the state, because that gives you the power. So it's this sense of rationalized universal ideals that then are imposed on society as universals to instantiate them within the body politic.
Yeah, essentially it's the belief that there is some set of rights that precedes laws.
That's right.
What, you know, however you want to say these rights come from, wherever you want to say.
It's a set of ideals that the laws are. The laws are instantiating a set of universal ideals.
Yeah. Well, yeah. When you say universal, it's the idea that man has these rights in general, not just the French man, not just the American man, like the man in nature. There's, whether it's the Rousseauian model or the Hobbesian model, there is some man in nature that is endowed with a certain set of rights, even though we haven't defined what the word rights means. And the Constitution or the Declaration of Rights or the Bill of Rights, whatever the document is formalizing these pre-existing rights that everybody agrees on, everybody recognizes, and we're going to use it not just to build a state, but to set the parameters of this state. So, like I said, when you read this essay, you see it very much reads like somebody who's criticizing the current global American empire, with one exception. And that exception is that today you would talk about human rights or you would talk about civil rights. Bentham has the same, you know, dismissive attitude about these ideas, but there's a different name for them. It's natural rights. He says the French who like to thump their constitution and thump this idea, this Enlightenment idea that's going to build this perfectly utopian, rational society. It's based on natural rights, which everybody recognizes, and you just have to throw that word natural in front of everything. He kind of says in an offhand comment in this essay, what else would you expect from people who worship nature as their real God?
Yeah, and it's also, when you talk about natural rights, it's also then, I think, a dig at the idea that these quote unquote rights are self-evident, that there's a self-evidence to them, and that might be one of, like, philosophically the most problematic idea, that we hold these ideas to be, or these truths to be self-evident. And, you know, it once you dig in and examine that, it becomes very problematic, the sort of self-evidence of it, like how and why and what makes them self-evident. So just to say like natural rights, it's sort of this kind of thing. Well, it's just objectively a better way to look at the world. This is just objectively the right thing to do. And everybody can see this, and that's, I think, the whole idea of taking a plug at natural rights is to say that somehow you've grounded this in objective reality, that this is just the way it is in the natural order, and everybody can see that this is the way it is in the natural order, which is not entirely obvious at all.
So it's funny you say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That's the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. And
no, I know.
It's interesting, though, that even though in American jurisprudence, the Declaration of Independence is supposed to be equal to the Constitution, the last say on things, the last word on things, Americans don't seem to have the same reverence for the Declaration that they do for the Constitution, especially not in post-1945 America. And it's just, it is very interesting that you said there's these two different models of Enlightenment liberalism, and I think they're very much embodied in these two American documents. And the Declaration of Independence was something, it was a source of national pride, but I don't think it became the foundation of American jurisprudence the way that the Constitution did. And I think that's why the United States was relatively functional for the first century and a half of its existence, modulo the Civil War era there.
Yeah, but there are keys in the Declaration of Independence that do help, in some ways, give up the game of intellectually of what's going, like ideologically what's happening, and what that are prescient in terms of tipping what is going to come. Like that. I believe it's in the direct declaration where they talk about a more perfect union, right? And and you begin to realize that, like, these guys really, they are utopians, and they're looking to instantiate a utopian model of government. And even if their model of government is to say that powerful people exist and they want to secure power for themselves, we are going to create a more perfect system that will then inhibit the growth of their power by playing them off against each other. And, and this is one of these things that system can, in a sense, curtail power.
Yeah, I agree with what you said there, but there is one distinction, and that's that Thomas Jefferson was very much an acolyte of Thomas Reid, who was a Scottish Enlightenment figure, not a French Enlightenment figure. And the Scottish Enlightenment was not about tearing up everything, quite the opposite. The Scottish Enlightenment arguably starts with the Act of Union in 1707, when the Crown of Scotland and the Crown of England are united, and it completely changes the political situation in Scotland. And the Scottish thinkers say, all right, we don't have to tear the past. This is just an opportunity to turn the page on things. We still have a respect for everything that happened before 1707, but now we are part of a great empire. Now we have a chance to look to the future and build upon what we have. There was nothing about Scottish Enlightenment thinking that was about tearing things down, whereas French Enlightenment, I can't say the same about that.
Yeah, and I think you're right there too, and that's probably one of the reasons why the American system was more enduring than the French, is because they made a concerted effort not to sweep away the past, even as they were working to abstract, rationalize it, and universalize it in many ways. But they were very clear to show how they were basing their system on, the Roman Republic and common law experience. And so they were taking these elements of the past and drawing a real connection to them, but then saying, using all these pieces that we find in the past, we can then develop a system that will fix the problems that have been handed down to us from the past, right? Which the big, from a merchant class perspective, and this is, that the problem is the vagaries of quality and leadership, right? So that, you can begin to or mitigate against that by developing a better system of governance that will then play off the powerful against each other in this system of balance of powers, right? So, but anyways, let's get into the Bentham essay and the kinds of things that he's observing, because I think that that's really useful for people to understand, especially today as we get as this universe, like you say, the boomercon mindset of universal rights. I saw another one again too. There was a British gentleman that was, ranting on about, free speech and how the government, shouldn't be impinging upon my right to say anything. And I'm like after all this time, how many people still just don't do the work to understand that these are just, the kind of thing that you're craving for the government to preserve your right for free speech. The whole concept from beginning to end is just problematic. I mean, first of all, the idea of free speech is problematic, but then the idea that the government is going to secure that right again through a set of legal traditions is also itself problematic.
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue because his introduction to the essay is exactly what you were talking about. He says, what is a constitution in general? And here is why these ideas of a written constitution are just logically incoherent. So I'll start by going over that.
Sure.
He says a constitution, what does it need to do? It needs to designate exactly which powers and to what extent it should designate exactly which powers should be vested in the state and to what extent they should be vested. And it should also completely distinguish these powers so that you don't have people in the state having turf wars, trying to step on each other's feet. He says it has to be coherent. It has to be complete. It can't have any, gray areas or empty spots, which people are going to be arguing over. It has to be clear to everybody, not just within your society, but universally. It has to not make up anything unless it's obvious to everybody. And it also has to not just do that, it has to define a set of lawmakers. It has to define whether it's a parliament or an assembly or whatever. It has to define a group of people who are endowed with the power to write laws. And so once you have all of that in place, then it just seems logical that now you're going to use this constitution, this written constitution, to judge laws that are written. And you're going to say that every law that's written is either valid or it's invalid. And how are you going to judge that? You're going to judge it based on whether it's consistent with the written constitution or the Bill of Rights or not. And says if the law turns out not to be consistent with this Declaration of Rights, I guess it must not be a valid law. So that's the framework he puts down, and I don't think that's an unreasonable description either.
It's a very fair description.
I think. Well, this is what I'm saying. You read this thing from 1796. I think it describes the ideals of not just the American government, but every Western government right now. This seems to be the Platonic ideal that they say they're going for. And Bentham just says on its face, this is silly. Like, first of all, it assumes that these values already exist and they just need enforcement. So who's going to do the enforcement? Secondly, it assumes that people are going to compare every law with the Constitution. Who's going to be doing the comparison in the first place? We think now it's going to be a set of judges that do it, but that hasn't always been true. In fact, if you look at the first few presidents of the United States, the first 6 or 7 presidents were all legal nerds. And because of that, they viewed it as them doing their duty to veto a law that was passed by Congress if it wasn't consistent with the Constitution. Nowadays, we think about the Supreme Court throwing out those unconstitutional laws. Originally, it was seen as the purview of the president to do that. So this is what Bentham's saying. Who is going to be the person who has the final say on whether or not a law is constitutional and ought to be thrown out. More importantly, though, he says that in the case of an emergency, you're going to have to write a new law that is not just consistent with all the existing laws, not just consistent with the Constitution, but suitable to cover the set of exigencies that you're dealing with right now, to cover the emergency situation. And he says just nobody is so smart that they know all of the ins and outs of the laws and the lay of the land politically. They know how to deal with the crisis. He says there's nobody who's that smart.
Well, and you can't predict. Yeah. You can't predict every possible crisis that you might have to face. Well, so how can you account for them constantly? This was Carl Schmitt's point of view. You know, he who is sovereign that decides the exception, right? And so, like, this is a fundamental flaw in constitutional law, that the Constitution cannot determine every possible circumstance. And so the person who either has to adjudicate it or adjust or write the new Constitution to grapple, to amend the Constitution to grapple with these problems, that person is outside of the law, which you've said everybody's under the law. So you've got a fundamental contradiction in your basic constitutional structure, that right from the outside, you've set up a group of people who are extra constitutional, whether it's the lawmakers, the president, or the judges, who are not subject to the law because they're the ones making the law.
Well, like I was saying, it's just amazing the number of things that Bentham predicted. He says you're just going to end up with a system where one generation comes up with the perfect constitution that deals with the world and the political situation in their time and place. And what's going to happen is that their grandchildren are going to be hobbled. Like right now, sure, when I say right now, I mean in the late 1700s. If there's a problem, we just pass a law, we convene Congress, we pass a law, and we deal with the problem. But when you have this restrictive constitution that's supposed to overarch everything, what are you going to do? What are your grandchildren supposed to do when they have a unique situation that comes up? They can't just convene and pass a damn law that deals with the problem at hand. They're going to have to get involved in all of these debates and get involved in all of these quagmires about the law, and just look at the problem that, I mean, I'm almost 40. I think I got in under the wire on this one, but just look at the problem that some 23-year-old is having right now. He has to deal with the fact that he has to pay a whole bunch of tax to deal with the welfare state and the pensions that his grandparents and great-grandparents voted into power. The Zoomers can't just get together and say, all right, we have a problem. Our country is being strangled by debt. Can we just fix this? Can we just cut the Gordian knot and just fix the problem, get the country solvent again? They can't do that because they're hobbled by this constitution that's in place. And again, it's just amazing the number of things he predicted in this.
Well, and then as before we got on air, you and I were talking about the whole question of, what's otherwise known as AI, right? These large language model algorithms, and I mean, at its heart, an algorithm is just basically a set of rules, and a set of rules is more or less like a set of laws. And you have these algorithms that are being tasked with more or less rewriting themselves almost at a pace that is, nearing what you might call a singularity, right? And how do you grapple with the ability to change social and societal rules at that kind of pace? If you develop a society like a surveillance society, and all you need to do is a few keystrokes, and you can begin surveilling. Even if you pass the laws more broadly that we want a surveillance state, once you open that Pandora's box, now you can change who's being surveyed for what, for why, in real time, right? Can you, as a constitutional body, as a legislative body, grapple with the writing of laws in real time? The kind of questions that begin to get faced in terms of the constitutional environment. I mean, I use the analogy of like 40K, right? You have a game master who develops a meta, and then The idea is to game the meta, and once you come up with janky combinations of the meta, then either you break the meta, you win for a bit, and somebody copies you, or the game company then changes and rebalances things again, and hopefully But this is so the idea that you can write a fixed constitution for all time that will protect the rights of man, that practical experience dealing with rules and game theories and game design tells you is really an impossibility to develop a static system like that you then develop a group of people who are outside of the law and who are the game masters, and those are your sovereigns, not the law.
Well, again, everything you said is right, but Bentham just said it at an even more base level than that. He says it's just the same arrogance that you see time and time again. It's the arrogance thinking that I live in the present, therefore I have I have the wisdom of everybody before me, therefore I'm smarter than everybody who came before me, therefore what I'm doing is right. He says this is one of the oldest hubrises out there. It keeps getting mankind into trouble. And he said that the idea of writing a Declaration of Rights is just yet another one of a long string of examples of this being done. And, I think now that this idea has basically taken over the entire Western world, we can't see the forest for the trees anymore. But, I certainly think we are ruled by a regime that thinks we are so much smarter and more enlightened than everybody who came before us. And again, same thing. It was predicted in 1796.
Yeah. Well, let's keep moving. Let's roll through this, because I think the thing is, I think it's just good, to go through it. I think step by step by step, and just to just pick it apart for people, so that just hopefully break the bubble.
Well, yeah, like I said, this essay, it gets a little bit dry in places because he goes through it, not even just clause by clause. He goes through it sentence by sentence. And, some sentences are not that offensive, but when he comes to something that sounds really stupid or ridiculous, yeah, he tears it apart. So the next question that he asks is just, why would you ever want a Declaration of Rights in the first place? He says, let's ask this question before we ask whether a declaration works or not. And he says, why would you do it? You'd have four possible reasons: to set bounds on the authority of the crown, to set bounds on the legislature, to give instructions to the legislature, or to establish legitimacy with the people. Well, he says the fourth one, there's just no temporal element to it. Sure, your constitution might be good for a time and place, but time marches on. It's not necessarily going to be right and suit people's tastes in a different era. So he says, forget the fourth one. We'll just look at the first three. And the first issue he comes up with is, who is the people? Is it supposed to be people in a state of nature? Is it supposed to be the French nation? In fact, the title of the declaration is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Who is man? Who is a citizen? And why should this idea of man include citizen, or why should citizen be a subset of all men? He asks this question, and then he says something that I quite appreciated. He says, guys, I'm British. Don't tell me what my rights are. If you're going to talk about universal rights, fine, do what you want to do in France, but don't tell me that me as a British subject, I have a perfectly functioning system, a perfectly functioning parliament. I don't need to listen to a bunch of French people telling me that I don't have good rights because they're not written down on a piece of paper.
Wow, that's in today's day and age of citizenship is nothing more than a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. You have your passport and your citizenship papers. You're a member of a society. And yeah, in the era of mass immigration, man, he really nails it in regard, because we live in an era where more or less the current liberal set is that there is no such thing as individual peoples. There's just universal fungible cogs that you can kind of move around everywhere, and they all have human rights. There are no peoples with histories or their own sense of law and what's right or wrong.
Yep. Yeah. So So to address those three points that Bentham made, just about why you would ever want a declaration in the first place. First of all, can it limit the crown? He says absolutely not, because by the time you're writing this piece of paper in the first place, the rights of the crown have already been limited, so we don't even need to discuss that one. Can it limit the assembly? Can it limit the lawmakers? Well, no, because the existence of the assembly already means you've conceded that popular sovereignty isn't good enough. If the people could decide what they wanted, why do you need an assembly in the first place? Let alone why do you need a Declaration of Rights to limit what they can and can't do? So, like, the fact that you trust this body of lawmakers to write laws for the state of emergency, that already tells you that the power must be unlimited by definition. Something that makes sense today, but again, just growing up in this liberal world, we kind of take it for granted that people thought about this a long time ago, but right from day one, no, Bentham was saying, no, this is a ridiculous idea. There's, like, as Yarvin would say, sovereignty is conserved. Somebody's always going to have enough power to do things in the state of exception, and you're not going to change that with a piece of paper. He says it's self-evident that you're not going to change that with a piece of paper.
Wow. And not only that, but the idea of democracy and popular sovereignty, that if you have a constitution, you cannot have both popular sovereignty and a constitution at the same time, because if the constitution can say this law is unconstitutional, you as a populace do not have sovereignty.
Yep. Yeah, and I think he even had a better way of wording that. He says, when an exception has to be made, that just means that the paper constitution has failed to limit the legislature. And when an exception is not made, that proves that the paper constitution hasn't set the right bounds. So already it just collapses underneath a logical inconsistency. So he hasn't even gotten to the line by line part yet. This is just the introduction. And already the idea of this is just,
the idea of a constitution and why it's dumb, actually.
Well, it's not even that it's dumb. He says it's just not logically coherent. He says,
exactly.
This is the country of René Descartes, the great abstract thinker who thinks that you come up with axioms, you come up with these lofty ideas and deduce everything from them. He says all the French are trying to do is take this Descartes logic and apply it to the law. And he says this is just not the way things work. You don't start with general laws and then derive specific laws from them. He says you start by writing laws that are specific to a time and a place, and usually a state of emergency. And when you have a bunch of laws that all seem to have the same character, then you write the general law. You say this is the abstraction of all of these existing laws. And for the law to remain coherent, the specific laws, the pre-existing specific laws, need to be coherent with the new general laws. He says you don't start with the general and then get the specific. He says that just the act of writing laws is by its very nature starting with the specific and going to the general. And he says this is just the French trying to be a little too French with their abstract way of thinking. He says, I'm British. We have our own way of doing things. We do things based on the idea of mutatis mutandis. We say we write the law that needs to be written, and if anything else needs to be changed to keep the law coherent, we'll make those changes as well. But we really don't want to make a change to the law if it's not small and specific. He says again, the French can do whatever they want, but this is the way we do it in England, and we have a perfectly good way of doing things. Thank you very much. We don't need your general rights of man or your abstract constitution. It's just, we have a perfectly good way of doing things. We don't need it.
It is interesting, when you look at it from a biblical perspective, and the idea of divine law, that God, lays down a series of moral laws for his people. Now, that also is within a covenant relationship between God and the people. So there is a sense of that it's occurring specifically for certain people and so forth. But even within that context, it's amazing how many times kings and leaders get into trouble because they either make vows about something or they establish, like Daniel in the lion's den, right? The laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked. and therefore Daniel must be thrown into the lion's den, even though it's obviously dumb that he's doing so. Or the one of, the vow that Saul made, not to eat on the day, and then his son Jonathan then eats honey and he's able to keep going, right? And so there's all of these then different points where somebody makes a vow. In other words, they establish a kind of law for themselves, and then in very short order it gets revealed as folly. And so you end up, even in the biblical tradition, with these two ideas of God's eternal law and his people, but then also there is this sense of wisdom in the moment, right? You take the example Solomon and the cutting up of the baby. There's always a situations that require you to deal with reality in the moment. And, I don't think there's a policy book anywhere where you would turn to sort of page 356, rule 12, subsection A, point 4, that says, in this section, you threaten to cut the baby in half and that will resolve the situation. It just isn't the kind of case that you can write a constitution or a set of constitutions to account for something like that. And, in that regard, I think that Bentham would fall, again, utilitarianism falls much more firmly into a stream of sort of practical realist wisdom of, in a sense, we're just going to try to deal with the world as it is and make decisions as they come at us based upon, our understanding today of the world that we're actually dealing with.
Well, now this is something that might feel a little bit weird to talk about today. It almost seems like, secular blasphemy, but he even, it's the next thing that I have written down in my notes here.
Sure.
The perfect lead into that. He says, don't get caught up on, he says that the French are getting caught up on trying to build their society based on liberty. He says, I'm just trying to build my society based on it, people being happy, and based on the society being functional. Who cares about liberty? And that's something that even me being born into this liberal world, I get a little bit uncomfortable saying something like that. From the point of view of a writer in the late 18th century, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And why shouldn't we think that way? Why should we make liberty our idol? Why should we idolize something that's a false god? Like, why do we treat liberty like it's the most important thing?
Yeah, well, this is that argument in a sense that comes back to, and this would be more geared towards the American context, right? Is that when one is under the yoke of oppression, freedom seems like I want the yoke of oppression taken off me. I want to be able to run my own affairs. I want to be able to do so without somebody's boot on my neck. But then to take that to a sort of a philosophical, to universalize that idea of not having somebody's, boot on your neck, and to say that liberty is an ideal that we must then try to instantiate, I think takes that concept far, far too far, because there's all kinds of situations in which not having liberty is the sort of the best mode and way to live your life, and for society to live its life, and to emphasize liberty and freedom. I mean, we see that today in like the sexual revolution and all of its downstream negative effects, but there's all kinds of examples where, absolute liberty just becomes farcical when you try to instantiate it. And so, I think Bentham is right to just sort of begin to poke at this idea, say, yeah, it's one thing to want the boot of the man off your neck. It's quite another thing to then say liberty is an ideal to which we must strive.
Well, and he even goes one step farther, and he says every law that has ever been written is going to violate your liberty in some way. Says if you really want to take it to the extreme, then every law is going to be illegitimate. The concept of liberty in the, I was going to say British, but specifically in the English context, comes out of the fact that their Reformation was kind of malformed. You had Henry VIII, who decided to come up with his own church because he wanted to get a divorce. And then his son Edward was supposed to be the guy who ushers in the new era of strict Protestantism. And then he dies young, and his Catholic sister comes back in. And then she dies young, and then her sister Elizabeth comes in, and she has to be Protestant because the Catholics view her as a bastard. But she really doesn't want to get involved in these theological debates. She just doesn't see it as worth her time. She just wants to go to church on Sunday, and that's why the Anglican Church kind of seems like a Catholic church with different stained glass windows, as I've said many times. The idea of liberty in the English context really comes from the fact that English Protestantism was disturbed in the incubation process, and you ended up with the Puritans, the Calvinists, and you ended up with the Anglicans, and they had to be able to live side by side while having separate liturgies and separate laws for how they're allowed to worship, but not consider each other to be heretics or blasphemous. So if you want to talk about liberty, that's just an idea that comes out of a very, very specific time and place, and then trying to just impose a completely abstract, Descartes-esque idea on France, a country that has a Catholic tradition, not a Protestant tradition. You're already running into a bunch of issues here.
Yeah, I know that's interesting in a sense. And it's probably another conversation for a whole different day between between the English Reformation and then the continental religious wars, where the various Protestant traditions were tied more firmly to a particular prince or state power, that then these different powers played off against each other, laying the groundwork, of course, for the Enlightenment, right? As people got fed up with, we have to get rid of all of this religious fervor in society and create a kind of neutral state ground where everybody can get along. And, the idea of liberalism in the neutral state was the solution that intellectuals this is an oversimplification, but that the neutral state and liberalism was in many ways the solution to the continental religious wars between Catholic, Protestant, and the various different Protestant sects. Whereas in England, as you say, you had this breakup of different sects much more locally, and people just found a way to get along.
Yeah,
and that created a very different understanding of what liberty meant. Again, it's another whole subject for a different podcast, probably.
Yeah, and I'm happy to come on and talk about that some other time, but I won't get bogged down in that. Because I can, we talk on group chats, I can get bogged down on this stuff, but I'm not going to.
Yeah, no. So let's keep moving forward, Bentham, here, because I think this is good.
Yeah, so he says that in the English tradition, he says you don't start with assent to the general concept. You start with the assent to the particular. And if you assent to a bunch of particular things, then sometimes the general idea will reveal itself. Or another way he writes it is from consequences, we learn the principle, as opposed to starting with the principle. So this is largely what he talks about for the rest of the essay. Is he talks about just the problems that you're going to come out with by starting with these principles, as opposed to starting small and then discovering the principles, which is, in his opinion, and in my opinion too, the way that law has to work. It's especially the way that common law in the British world is going to work.
Well, and if you're drawing principles from case law, you're not universalizing them, and you're always opening yourself up to adapting to new particulars, because you're not trying to reimpose a universal back onto society that says, like, oh, we must maintain free speech, right? And this principle then must be we must find a way to instantiate this principle in every circumstance. Yeah. So, okay, so go on. So what are some of the things that he then begins to pick apart in this essay in terms of the specific rights of man?
Sure. So I'm just gonna keep going through the intro here. I'm just
Sure.
gonna get to the rest of this. But yeah, just to what you just said there is that, yeah, the one way of saying that is that instead of the general being the thing to aspire to, the general just needs to be the shorthand for a bunch of the particular cases. I think that's another way of saying that, and that's the way Bentham says it in the essay. He says that the idea of a constitution in general, it necessarily has to make the constitution, the idea of a constitution in general just necessarily has to make the government bigger, because you're just going to end up with these states of exception that come up over and over again, and you're going to have to expand the government to deal with these ever increasing states of exception. And you look at the modern world, you have a lot of politicians or a lot of activists who insist that it's a state of exception right now, and new laws and new government programs need to be made to deal with this state of exception. So he says the idea that a constitution is ever going to limit the scope of a state is just, it's fanciful thinking.
Well, and you can look at it this way as well too. Like if you and I are both trying to aspire to the same rights, a good one would be freedom of association, and freedom of association and disassociation. So if I don't want to let you into my club, you being somebody of a different skin color, ethnicity, or gender or whatever, then we have a conflict, because you say, I'd like to belong to your club, and I say, well, no, I don't want you in my club. And so who's going to adjudicate that, right? Do I get to adjudicate that myself? And if you take this and you magnify this out upon thousands of different problems, eventually the state grows to have to adjudicate all of these different frictions and conflicts, what you might otherwise term as harms between people. And then the state then legitimizes itself by almost finding conflicts between people. Right. And so people don't understand how a constitution and this type of thing will inevitably lead to tyranny and totalitarianism.
Yeah. And again, that's another perfect segue, because he says just the act of writing a Declaration of Rights, it's going to make your legislatures necessarily weak in understanding the situation on the ground, because they're going to be looking at these high, lofty principles. But more importantly, it gives them a tool to attack their opponents, because all that legislatures are going to do and say, my opponents are limiting your rights, let's treat them as your enemy. And
that's unconstitutional.
Or worse, he's trying to limit your rights. And if somebody's trying to limit your rights, there is very much a religious tradition that says you can take that person's life, especially in the Scottish Enlightenment tradition. I'm not so familiar with how it worked in France, but George Buchanan said that. He said, if a king tells you to do something that violates your conscience, you still have the right to kill the king. So if you're talking about your political opponents violating people's rights and their freedom of conscience, that can have, there's some subtext there. There's some violent subtext that would have been obvious in the 18th century.
Hence the American Civil War.
Well, that's a different ball of worms. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but yeah. Anyways,
but I mean, yes, you bring that up. What was the what do people say with the 20th century mythology of the Civil War? What do they say? They say the Civil War ended with us adding 3 amendments to the Constitution. That's how they describe it. That's how much we view things through the lens of constitutionalism. Not it ended with 600,000 people dead. Not it ended with a complete lost generation and economic disaster for the South. It ended with the Constitution changing.
Well, and with almost the complete obliteration of Southern culture, because you had really two American cultures at the time, in which was going to be dominant, right? And so the Northern industrial culture, almost entirely wiped out the Southern agrarian culture. And So there was a kind of cultural genocide that went along with you got three constitutional amendments through and that was determined, but the cost of it was very, very high.
Yeah. So I'm just before I get to the actual rebuttal of the point by point. I know we're an hour into this, but this is the last thing he said in the intro. He says the one biggest thing that just stands out to him about the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is it keeps using the word can. It says legislators can do this or legislators can't do that, or laws can do this and can't do that. He says this is just ridiculous because there's no physical reason why it can't. There's no legal reason why it can't, and there's no moral reason why it can't. So why are we using the word can? He says it would make more sense if a document like this said the law ought not to do this or the law ought to do this. But he says by the time you're using the word ought and ought not instead of can and cannot, then what's the point of the Constitution? You're already admitting that it's not legally binding in the first place. So that's the last thing he had to say before he jumped into rebutting the points one by one. But again, that makes perfect sense when you think about it, but it almost seems like a heresy to talk like that these days.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Like, yeah, and this is part of the problem, like, because actually nowadays, if laws are being written at all, they get written with great discretion to say, like, the agency shall work this out on, more or less on its own, right? As the agency deems fit. In a sense, that the lawmakers no longer even have control over their own laws. The can and the should and the may and the ought or ought not. The idea that they can, should, or ought not is almost in itself laughable anyways, because they just basically have told the bureaucracy, go and do as you see fit. Instantiate this as you choose. So the whole idea just sort of breaks down over time. And the idea that you can go back to, let's go back to the sort of the basics of the Constitution, whether French or American, is in itself, ridiculous on the face. And I think Bentham sort of pokes that out. So what does he say then about certain of the actual rights then?
Sure. So Article 1 of the French Constitution, or the French Declaration, and if you've taken a history class, I'm sure you've heard this before, but he says it makes 4 claims. It says all men are born free, all men remain free, all men have equal rights, and any distinctions between men must be based on common utility. And he says just right off the bat, this is just nonsense that just is not even internally coherent. He says men are just self-evidently not born free. I mean, this is something that Augustine said in the 5th century. Like, he says a helpless child is not a free man. Are you going to tell me that this child should have the same rights as I do if the kid can't even feed himself without being dependent on his parents? So he says right off the bat, starting a sentence with all men are born free, says it's just self-evidently false. Now, obviously, the objection there is slavery, because it's the late 18th century. But slavery depends on laws. So how are you even going to say somebody is a slave or not a slave without a pre-existing framework, let alone define slavery, let alone create a list of rights that are supposed to pre-exist laws that deal with slavery? How are you going to use this Constitution to get rid of slavery when slavery is something that has to be defined by law? He says it's just not even internally coherent, if that makes sense. Says if this,
you have to define what a slave is before you can get rid of a slave.
Yeah. Well, he says the concept of a slave is already subordinate to the laws. Yeah. So how can you use a document that's supposed to precede the laws to say that somebody can't be a slave? That's his first argument right off the bat for literally the first sentence of the Declaration of Man. So again, this goes right back to what you were saying, this infinite regress problem of who's going to enforce the Constitution, or who's going to say what is and isn't constitutional. He says that even just the first 5 words, all men are born free, is just immediately going to collapse under its own weight. And he says, already we have a perfectly good system in place where we have a pre-existing law. He says, if you don't like the law, just repeal it. Like, why do you need to create an overarching system to deal with an issue like slavery, saying that slavery is bad in a philosophical sense? What's the point in doing that when if you're really opposed to slavery, just write a law that makes slavery illegal, full stop.
Done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and again, this is what I was saying earlier about everything coming from the abstract way of thinking, from the way of Descartes. This is where Bentham kind of leans into Descartes a little bit. He says Descartes said whatever is, and then deduces everything. Well, he says the anarchist is just going to invert Descartes and say whatever is not, or whatever is shouldn't be. We need to overthrow everything. And he says, how is that any more or less ridiculous than starting with a rational set of laws that are starting with a rational set of rules that are supposed to underpin all of your laws? He says, if you're going to start with rationalism, what stops you from starting with anarchism?
Nothing, actually.
And that's what he's saying. Yep.
Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he says, yes, Bentham is not being flippant about these problems. He just says we've already addressed these philosophical questions hundreds of years ago. He said that Francis Bacon said that, there's going to be cruel men, even cruel men who become legislatures. And he says Bacon said that one of the definitions of a cruel man is somebody who makes torture the punishment for breaking a law just because he wants to torture somebody. But he says this has always existed. We're going to have to deal with it. The way you deal with that is by coming up with a moral framework to deal with a wicked legislature. You don't do that by trying to rewrite everything based on abstract principles.
Or developing, you have a right not to be tortured.
Well, exactly. That's not going to save you if you have somebody torturing you. I mean, I think the Soviet Union had a stronger Bill of Rights than the United States did. Did that stop them from torturing anybody? No, it didn't.
I mean, wow. Yeah, the question is whether or not it's stopping Americans from torturing anybody or not is an open question, too.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, I have strong opinions on the year 2020. I'm not even going to go down there right now. So the next thing that Bentham takes issue with is the idea that all men are born equal in rights, let alone, so first of all, he says man born free. That just doesn't even make sense. Are all men born equal in rights? He says, no. You wouldn't expect all children to get equal inheritance. The firstborn son gets inheritance. This is a system that's developed over the centuries. Does that mean that by following this tradition, you are treating the rest of your children like they're subhuman? No, that's just the way it is. It's our tradition. You can even make the argument that, your firstborn son who's going to inherit the land and inherit the titles, yes, he does have more rights than your second-born, third-born, fourth-born son. But, who cares? Get over it. Like, you're not God. You don't get to rewrite a set of rules to say this isn't okay because you think it's unfair. That's just a very immature and almost childish way of looking at the world. And he just goes right down the list from there. He says that, this is quite relevant to the idea of the global American empire just trying to spread its laws everywhere. Because he says it's only a matter of time before the French say, all right, since these laws are universal, that means people in other countries are being gypped out of their basic natural rights. So France is going to have to start invading other countries to impose these written down rights on other countries, these enlightened rights to just save people from their backwards traditions and their backwards way of doing things. So it really is amazing how much he foresaw in this, just in this essay. He says, just starting with the idea of a universal set of rights, what's going to stop you from invading the next country and feeling righteous about doing it because they don't have this Declaration of Rights? We do.
Yeah, or just simply imposing it upon another country that you've conquered and saying that, which African country was it that just sort of adopted the American Constitution wholesale?
Liberia.
And and it was just a total disaster.
Yep. Well, it wasn't just a total disaster. It was supposed to be for freed slaves. And what was the first thing that happened when they sent the freed slaves over there? They started enslaving the locals. So.
Yeah. I know. You can't make this stuff up, really. I mean, you can, but it's generally not as interesting as what actually happens.
But again, so his next issue is, he says the first clause says that all men must remain equal in rights. He says that's not true. If you want to get a trade, you're going to be an apprentice who is subject to a master who can punish or discipline you. Does that mean that the idea of an apprenticeship isn't right because the apprentice and the master don't have the same rights? It says the ward and the guardian don't have the same rights. The wife and the husband don't have the same rights. The lunatic and the doctor don't have the same rights. He says, it's just the idea that everybody's supposed to have the same rights. It's really going to have a lot of bad knock-on effects. And like I was saying when we started this, he foresees the fact that men and women are going to end up at each other's throats because women and men are going to think that whatever a woman can do, a man should be able to do, and whatever a man should be able to do, a woman should be able to do, because it's just self-evident, because everybody has the same rights because the piece of paper said so. And he just says, you're really opening a big Pandora's box if you want to go down this path of saying that everybody has to remain equal in rights. He says, you're going to end up in a very dark place if you do that. In fact, he even says the quickest way to an unhappy marriage is just making the husband and wife think that they should be equal in every way.
Yeah. Wow. Based Bentham, as they say, right? It's, yeah. I mean, it's kind of hard to look around and go like, yeah, dude's got a point.
Well, this is what I'm saying. I like reading a lot of old stuff. I'm sure you do too. And it's
sure.
Interesting when you read an old essay and somebody makes one or two predictions. Yeah, he called that. Yeah, he called that. This is not a very long essay. Like I said, it's maybe 10 or 12 pages long, but it's just every page he has predictions about what's going to happen if you start with a universal set of rights, and they all come true.
Well, and this is one of the reasons why I think a lot of us in this online sphere began reading people from the early 20th century and the middle of the 1800s and older, is because in many ways they would talk about things that would happen, and they did it 30, 40, 100 years beforehand. And then that makes you look at it and go like, well, what did they see then that other people didn't see? And those are the kind of things I should maybe be paying attention to, because that's instructive. And once you begin to start doing that, the whole edifice begins to crumble, because you realize that, wait a minute, even at the time as everybody was trumpeting all this stuff as the greatest thing, there were also a group of people going like, yeah, maybe not so much. And I think today at this point in the downside of, the backside of this global empire that we're living in, that to be able to then diagnose, it helps us diagnose what went wrong by going back to some of these old authors and asking ourselves, what did they see that the defenders of these ideas didn't, or refused to see, or didn't want to see, or saw but then ignored them anyways, And I think that that's important for us going forward.
Yep. Well, actually, on that point, like it's not like all of English high society was not enthusiastic about the French Revolution. In fact, on the contrary, I think the Prince Regent George IV was a supporter of the French Revolution until people's heads started getting cut off. But like one of the attitudes was, this is the year 1789, which is the exact 100-year the exact 100-year anniversary of the Glorious Revolution. So this must be the providence of God that God wants France to have a limited government as well, or at least a limited monarchy. In fact, it was the norm that people back then were supporting the French Revolution, even in Britain, at least until things went sour. Obviously, the most famous example from the time was Edmund Burke, who wrote his Reflections on the French Revolution, where he said this was going to be a total disaster. But again, Bentham, I think just reading this essay, he belongs right up there with Edmund Burke when it comes to when it comes to reading primary sources from the time, who called it at the time, not 20 years afterwards. Like Joseph de Maistre, I know he's another big one in our circle. He was kind of the first guy after the fact to say that the revolution was a bad idea, who didn't have ulterior motives. Like, he wasn't some aristocrat who had half his family sent to the guillotine. He was a guy who didn't have a horse in the race, but he just looked back at it and said, yeah, the revolution was a really stupid idea. Bentham and Burke were writing about it at the time, looking forward.
Yeah. And that's, I think, really the significant thing, is that they were able to see what was going on and then look at it. It's similar to someone like, say, the Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce, who looked at what was happening with the transformations in Western capitalist societies, and basically predicted in the 40s and 50s that gay marriage was going to come, because he could look at what was happening already in the 40s and 50s intellectually and ideologically, and say that the logical conclusion of what the reasons that they're giving for the things that they're doing will lead here. And sure enough, they led there. And people said that they weren't going to lead there, but they led there, because the guys who were looking at, and I think Bentham and, as like you say, Burke and others, were doing the work at the time, saying, that's one of the reasons too why I like somebody like Jacques Ellul, because just at the peak, the height of when everybody was trumpeting and triumphing the technological society, Ellul was stepping back and saying, yeah, this thing's going to be a disaster. And I'm not here to say whether you should or shouldn't or don't, but this is what's going on, and you can take it for what it's worth or don't. But and I think in that regard, this is why I think somebody like Bentham is good. And I think when you're looking at people across the sphere who are, who should you take seriously? And I think these are one of these bellwether tests, is that, people who are looking to defend and restore the Constitution, who are looking to, in a sense, purify it of the way it's been corrupted and so forth. And you kind of say it straight out, that as well-meaning as many of these folks are, and there are a lot of times they're good guys who want the world to be a better place, but they're basically working for the system. Yep. And you have to understand that these are good guys who I think mean well, but they are working for the system. And I think that's really what somebody like Bentham does, is say, hey, listen, if you look at all of these core foundations of the system, it's built on sand, and you need to see it as such and stop defending it.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. Yeah, just
and where you go from here, I don't know, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to finish off what he was saying about the first clause, is he said the last sentence of it was that social distinctions can only exist if there is common utility. He says this is just blank slate nonsense. It's just another way of saying tabula rasa. And he says, again, that's just building a house on sand, as you said. He said every word of that is nonsense, including what he said before. It says the word can. He said I could maybe buy it if it said social distinctions only ought to exist if there's common utility, but even that's pushing it. He says just straight up, yes, there's a lot of bad laws in society. We're humans writing laws. Of course, there's going to be bad laws passed. The stupidest way to deal with a bunch of bad laws is to try to pass some umbrella legislation that gets rid of them all in one shot. He says, what you do is if there's a bad law, you repeal the law. He says, why do you, like, you're just trying to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut if you think there are laws of the land which are unjust or just bad laws, however you want to define that. Says, like, you know, instead of trying to use the power tools and trying to, you know, rebuild the whole house, just replace the cabinet or just replace the one part of the law that isn't working. Start with that.
The battle in the 20th century over something like abortion is a good example of, you know, just even if, say, a majority wanted to do something about it, the inability to do something about it because it's now been deemed constitutional. You know, and you've got a whole layer of laws this way that get argued because they're quote unquote constitutional, that they can't be touched because a ruling has been made. But yet at the same time, we know, like, you know, segregation was a law of the land and it was constitutional until it wasn't. Right. Yeah. And so in that regard, if things are constitutional till they're not, I mean, what does that say about the Constitution? Right. And that's really kind of the other point of Bentham. Now, I guess maybe before we go, does he say anything interesting about some of these key ones, like, you know, right to free, like religion, expression, you know, speech? Were there any sort of fun observations that he made in these regards that we might leave with the audience before we wind it up?
Since you said freedom of association, that's the second article, so I'll read that one. Because again, it's not making up. You're just feeding me all of these, and they just happen to be the next thing that he talked about. Is the second article of the Declaration is that the end view of a political association is preservation of a man's natural rights. So he says we're associating with each other to preserve our rights, whether those are, you know, the right to associate or the right to have a religion or the right to your conscience or whatever it is. And he just says this is just a complete word salad because it has the necessary assumptions you need is that A, rights precede government, hence the natural rights. B, you have rights that can't be abrogated. He said we've already gone through. That's just not that's already we've already gone through the fact that that's not logically consistent. And 3 is that your governments must derive origin from these formal associations. And like, just think about it. Who has rights if he doesn't have a government? Like the idea that rights are going to precede laws or precede the government. He says, again, something that may seem a little bit like blasphemy to say these days, but he says savages have no rights. They have no government, so how the hell can they have no rights? Sorry, how the hell can they have rights? He says that people are going to start arguing that their unhappiness comes from a lack of rights. And he says this is just, at best, this is wishful thinking, because what he thinks is going to happen is that you're going to start giving people rights. You're going to start making up rights just to give people. And what's going to happen? They're going to be miserable anyways. Is that not a good prediction for what's going to happen these days?
Well, yeah. And then and then the number of quote unquote universal rights that precede society will continue to grow magically. And that's, you know, it is really astounding, this idea that the rights precede. Now, from, if you took it like sort of from the Christian biblical perspective, I know that you can find a couple passages where the word rights are used, but if you really look at the scope of Scripture, anytime that word may be used, and I think it's just a handful of spots, it's almost always derivative. And my big problem with the whole idea of a right is that it's something that you're owed. You know, whether it's you're owed the ability to speak your mind and say whatever you want to say. You know, nobody can stop you. This is something that's owed to you. You know, and on each and every one. Whereas typically the biblical way is to look at it as a series of you have obligations to your fellow citizen and your fellow man. And so you have the obligation to treat them in a certain way, to speak towards them in a certain way, to, you know, And from your obligations towards somebody else, then people have derived, they universalize this and say, then everybody deserves to be treated in this way.
Yeah.
And now we're going to instantiate this in a human law. And this idea is going to precede both law and government, as Bentham says. And that's, the idea that you can manage that, so like, as you say, a tribe of primitives who don't have a form of, like, a sophisticated form of government, how are they ever going to grasp the idea that there's a universal that precedes a government that they don't have?
Yeah. So I'm just going to read two more things that I just
sure.
Let's just. It's not that long of an essay if anybody wants to read this, but I recommend anybody read it because it's just my eyebrows raised when I read it, just the number of predictions he got right. But I'm just going to go through two more things and then I'll wrap it up. The Declaration says that man's fundamental rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. And when we talk about natural rights, that means these are rights that by definition precede laws. So again, Bentham just says this comes from nature worship. He says that the way that these people worded that clause already gives up the game, that they don't believe in any sort of a God. They believe that nature is what endows man with everything. It says even the idea of universalism must be almost definitionally the concept of laws for a man in nature. And so he says the Frenchman must contact his oracle and ask what laws are proper and what laws are improper. And he says by oracle, just what laws would a man in nature naturally expect when he enters civilization. So he's already saying this is a bunch of nonsense. But just going through these one by one, he says liberty is abstract. So, and how can you possibly declare rights without encroaching on liberty? He says that's already a contradiction, especially because rights have obligations. So, how would you ever maximize liberty without minimizing rights? He says that's the first issue he has with that. The second is that the concept of property already on its face. The concept of property requires you limit liberty because, I own this piece of property means by definition, I can tell somebody not to come on it. So the whole concept of property also has a navel-gazing aspect to it. I can say I have the right to this thing, but also how do I get the thing in the first place? Does that mean that the government just has to start giving me things because that increases my right to property? Again, you look at questions of the welfare state. I maybe shouldn't be so flippant by asking that because I think those are questions that are truly asked today. But he says just the idea of a constitutional right to property is just going to put you on a spiral that leads you to ruin. And again, I don't think he was wrong with that, with that prediction. And he also says that it's just going to call every law into question, every tax, every fine, every punishment. Says at some point, if you have a right to property, a fundamental right to property to an abstract concept like this, you're just going to end up gazing at your navel and wasting all your time because every single law is going to have a punishment that necessarily limits your property. The third one is he talked about security. It establishes the right to not be hurt. And this is very germane to the common era because he asks, do we just now make it illegal to take risks? I mean,
yeah.
Look at the world we live in. There's a lot of regulations, and we have a lot of legislatures and a lot of bureaucrats ruling over us who seem to have no meaning in life other than how do I be the wet blanket and how do I limit other people from enjoying themselves and how do I limit other people from taking risks in the name of safety or safetyism. He also said, just let me finish this. He also said that corporal punishment is going to be gone because that eliminates your right to security. And he says now you're not going to be able to make the cops or the military do anything dangerous. So he says, what does this concept mean when you take it to its logical extent? And the thing is, when all these questions he asked, yeah, look at the cops in 2020 deciding to refuse to do anything while a bunch of hoodlums burned down the streets. The cops were just standing there with their hands on their hips. You could argue this goes right back to this French Revolution idea that man has a right to security. So,
well, or he has some other right to free speech or to protest or whatever. But I don't have a right to protect my storefront, these types of things. And how do I protect my storefront? Well, with violence, like if I shoot the castle laws are now this is a big thing in Canada right now is castle laws. Like, do I have a right to shoot somebody who comes on my property? Because it's my property. If I have a right to property, I should have a right to shoot somebody who comes on my property, right?
Well, that's what the definition of property you would think is, yes.
Yeah, and so, but the castle law says, well, no, you can't shoot somebody who comes onto your property. That would be a violation of his rights to bodily integrity.
Well, there you go. That's what he said. Again, he says you start with these abstract, Cartesian rights, and he says they're just, you're going to end up in a rat's nest of contradictions. So, like I said, I'm just going to finish this off. Like I said,
sure.
Some of the clauses in the French Declaration aren't that offensive. Bentham does go through them all one by one. I think sometimes he's a little bit melodramatic when he goes after clause 14 or whatever that is not necessarily as offensive as some of the others. But like as when he digs into these clauses in the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, I enjoy reading it, and it just it makes you wonder why the current people who rule over us don't have this same level of common sense. But just getting to the conclusion of his essay, he goes back. He says that these general propositions that can be used to derive all other laws, he says this is just arrogance and hubris that's going to lead us to anarchy in the end. And the title of the essay is Anarchical Fallacies, and that's why it's called that. He says just the end point of having a written declaration of rights is anarchy. That's his big punchline. He says these rights are great, but do I have the right to harm anybody who gets in the way of my rights? He says that question is left unopened by this document, and he's really not easy with the fact that it's left open by this document, because he says the idea of equality just means I can start tearing other men down. Doesn't mean that they have to build me up. It means I can tear them down to create equality. Again, I don't think that that's not germane to the world we live in. But then he ends on a note where he goes back to what he was saying at the start, that like, I'm British. We have a perfectly good tradition in Britain. I really don't need to be lectured to by a bunch of French academics. And I really like the way he said this. He said, my people introduced Shakespeare. Theater is something that the French couldn't do. Theater is something that my people did well. So he's just very particularizing this to the English to the English context. And he said, Shakespeare is my people's pride. Shakespearean villains, you have Iago, you have Macbeth, you have a bunch of the most well-written villains in all of literature who really suss out the human condition, who look for every excuse they can find to be evil. He says not a single villain in Shakespeare ever talks about how he should be entitled to harm another person because he has these rights that nature gave to him. And I don't know, I really like the way that he ended that, because he said, you know what, do what you want in France, but I'm British. I have a proud tradition. I'm not going to be lectured to by somebody else on concepts of freedom and rights. And, it just kind of flips him the middle finger and says, I'm just not listening to you guys. He also, you think about how many theater kids are occupying our government right now. The theater kid occupied government is a meme that's going around our circle. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, people like Cory Booker, who just want to get in front of a camera and give a big melodramatic soliloquy, and they don't seem to care about actually writing laws. They just seem to want to be melodramatic to scratch that itch. He said that rights will turn. He said that the concept of rights are just going to turn your Senate into a stage. I think that was a perfect way of ending this. He said that by coming up with a list of rights, all you're going to do is turn your legislation into a stage where people are being melodramatic about how this right or that liberty is constantly being violated or encroached upon, and your Senate is just going to become a mockery. And I don't know. I thought that was a perfect way of ending an essay like this.
Yes. Yeah. No. You're absolutely right, and that really he really nails it, and it's a shame that more people who are in quote unquote dissident spheres are not reading and taking to heart an essay like Bentham's. But I think mostly because people don't want to hear what he has to say, because they still, in a sense, they want to believe the brochures. And like, if I don't believe the brochures, what then? What is next, right? And it's not even a sense of like, what if I don't believe? What are the things that I'm told to believe in the brochures, like liberty and so forth? What if these are not the right things to believe in? Like, how far down the rabbit hole does it really go once you begin to sort of opening it up? And so most people just kind of keep on keeping on, trying to preserve the current system, because preserving the current system preserves the current order. And then I don't have to think about bad things, or why everything that I believe is built on a foundation that's shifting sands, basically.
Well, I mean, it's not even necessarily a bad thing to think that way. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have the temperament that the lights come on every day. Society is somewhat stable, even if it's in decline. So do I want to really make a big change to fix things? Because what if I remove a load-bearing wall and the whole society collapses? I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that temperament.
There is some truth to that, Ben.
Yeah, but it still is, as you said, it's worth a second look, and it's worth reading people who said at the time this is going to be a terrible idea, and more importantly, their predictions turned out to come true.
And I think, for somebody who values the path of parallelism, I think it's also okay to say that the current system is built on a foundation of sand, and to say, I don't necessarily want to sweep the current system away because, I'm not a revolutionary and bad things would happen. And, millions don't need to die just because I need to be proven right. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you should know that everything today is built on sand, and that maybe it might be a good idea to also begin actively preparing for an alternative to, if it's not you or your children, but maybe it's your grandchildren, have to be ready to live in a world where all of the things that we take for granted have maybe toppled because finally, the flood comes and washes away the sand.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, Ben, thank you. It's been a lot of fun. This is, Constitution, especially for Canadians. It's one of those things. I mean, I think many of us went through a phase where we fell in love with the American Constitution because the ideas just seemed so compelling. Liberty, freedom, the grand experiment. But then also our situation caused us to keep looking and keep digging. And we got to a point where, like you and I and others, where we've realized, like, yeah, everything is not what it seems. So I think it's good that we get together, we have these conversations, and we examine some of these ideas and hopefully open a few people's eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even mention the elephant in the room, which is that in Canada, we technically have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we're under this same fallacy ourselves. I don't think anybody takes it seriously. It was a pipe dream of Pierre Trudeau, because I think he wanted us to be more in line with the global American empire, United Nations way of doing things. But I don't think anybody takes that seriously here.
Not unless they can get an advantage for it. But yeah, or unless you're in Alberta and you're trying to or Quebec, and you're trying to activate the notwithstanding clause, which is pretty much the only piece of the Constitution that we generally actually hear about on a day-to-day basis here in Canada.
Well, it's what's the notwithstanding clause but the Schmittian exception? Like literally,
it's exactly it.
Mm-hmm.
Built into the Constitution that you can, if you have the right circumstances, you can ignore it.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. Anyways, Ben, thank you for coming on. It was a real pleasure.
My pleasure as well.
I hope we're going to have to get together again soon, and we're going to talk about art and why modern art is bad, actually. After I did a whole episode of why modern art is good, actually. So we're going to have to save that one for the listener soon.
Well, I'll plug my own podcast. I have
do that, please. Podcast. Sorry.
Yeah,
we should.
No, my podcast is called Radio Free History. It's just, it is available through the usual sources, but for the last 6 months, I've been doing an art history series. So you probably want to watch that on YouTube because there's a visual component to it. But yeah, I've started in the Renaissance. I expected it to be just a one-off, almost gimmick episode. Like, how did art get ugly? I just assumed that at some point it became a money laundering scam and there would be a simple story behind it. But it's getting to the point where you literally can't listen to it in a day because after my next episode, there will be more than 24 hours of content that I've put out. It's a long story and it's a self-referential story as well because so many of these artists are intentionally harkening back to old artists. So it's a story with a lot of self-reference in it. I've been working on it for the whole year. I don't want to call it my magnum opus yet until it's finished. I expected it to be a gimmick, but my 2025 was the year I decided to rewrite all of art history because I got down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, the artist and his energies are maybe the greatest creative force known to humanity.
Well, I'm at the point where I just want this story out in the world, even if nobody listens to it other than you and a couple of my relatives. I just want this story out there for posterity because I want people just to have an answer to why do we duct tape bananas to walls again and sell it for millions of dollars?
Why couldn't I manage to do that? Yeah,
because it's a money laundering scheme. It is a money laundering scheme. Yeah, I know, that's just it. I'm not saying it's not a money laundering scheme. It absolutely is. Jeff Koons, the guy who did the stainless steel balloon dog, I think he was open about the fact that it was a money laundering scheme. It's just, how did we get to that point in the first place, which is a long, convoluted story.
There you go. Anyways, let's cut that off now, and we'll bid adieu to the listeners and those handful who have remained through the full hour and 42 minutes. Thank you for your patience, and we will see you next time.